In the eyes of everyone who knew them, he was nothing more than a grease-stained mechanic with calloused hands and a faded work shirt that smelled permanently of motor oil and metal shavings. A man who moved through the world without announcement, without ambition that anyone could see, without the particular shine that the people in Diana Harlow's world had learned to project as proof of their worth. She was 36 years old, a CEO whose face had appeared on the cover of 3 business magazines in a single calendar year. A woman who commanded boardrooms and closed deals that lesser executives only dreamed about, a figure whose name had become a kind of shorthand in certain circles for the specific combination of beauty and ruthlessness that the financial press loved to profile. The morning they sat across from each other in the cold, composed light of a lawyer's office, she laughed not a small, embarrassed laugh, not the involuntary kind that escapes when you are nervous, but a full, deliberate, perfectly aimed laugh. The kind constructed specifically to wound. She told the attorney, loud enough for every person in that room to hear every syllable, that the man sitting across from her would be on his knees begging within 6 months. She believed it the way people believe in gravity, as though it were simply the natural order of things, as though the universe had been organized with her perspective in mind. But the universe, it turned out, had long since stopped obeying her expectations, because when she followed him out of that building and watched a uniformed driver open the door of a car she had only ever seen in automotive exhibitions, and watched that driver incline his head in the precise manner of a man who has served extraordinary principles his entire professional life, and heard that driver address her soon-to-be ex-husband as chairman, the entire architecture of the life she thought she understood came apart at the seams, and nothing she had prepared herself for that morning had prepared her for this. Her name was Diana Harlow, and she had spent the better part of her adult life building something from almost nothing. She had grown up in a middle-class household in Connecticut, the daughter of a school librarian and a hardware store manager, and she had watched both her parents work themselves to exhaustion for a life that was comfortable, but never quite enough, never quite free of the low-grade anxiety that comes from knowing that one bad season could alter everything. That observation had lit a fire in her at a young age, and it had never gone out. She had clawed her way through a business degree on a partial scholarship, had taken a junior analyst position at a consulting firm directly out of college, and had worked 70-hour weeks for a decade, until she understood the machinery of corporate finance better than most of the men who had inherited their positions rather than earned them. She had been passed over twice for promotion by senior partners, who used words like aggressive as though it were a liability rather than a qualification, and she had used those 2 rejections the way certain people use obstacles as fuel. By the time she founded Harlow Meridian Group at 31, she already had the instincts of someone twice her age, and a contact list that had taken her a decade of deliberate cultivation to build. By 36, her firm managed a portfolio that touched real estate development, retail technology, and sustainable logistics across 11 states. Her net worth had crossed into the tens of millions. She was photographed at galas and industry conferences. She was quoted in financial publications as someone to watch. Then, as someone who had already arrived, she had learned to move through the world of wealth with the ease of someone born to it, even though she had built every inch of that ease by hand. And there was a particular pride in that, a pride that, over time, had calcified into something less admirable than its origins, something that had begun to mistake itself for discernment. Her husband's name was Nathan Cole. He was 38 years old and ran a small repair garage on the outskirts of Stamford called Cole Automotive, a single-bay operation tucked behind a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese sandwich shop, the kind of place that had a hand-lettered sign in the window and a waiting area, with 3 plastic chairs and a coffee maker that produced something technically classifiable as coffee. He had large, steady hands built for precision work, the kind of hands that could hold a component no larger than a coin and sense immediately what was wrong with it. He had a quiet manner that some people mistook for slowness, and that those who knew him better recognized as the quality of someone who did not speak unless he had something worth saying. His eyes were attentive in a way that never called attention to itself, and he missed very little, even when his face revealed nothing. When Diana had first met him at a friend's backyard barbecue 9 years ago, she had been drawn to exactly that quality, the stillness of him, the way he listened without performing interest, the way he laughed at something genuinely funny, without needing a room to validate the reaction. He had seemed, to her, like an anchor in a world that was always tilting. She had fallen in love with him over the course of that summer, and they had married the following spring in a small ceremony, with 40 guests and wildflowers from her mother's garden. He had kissed her in the middle of his vows, not at the end, but in the middle, when something she said had moved him past the ability to wait and the whole room had laughed, and she had pressed her forehead against his and thought, "This is everything I have ever wanted, that I did not know I was looking for." For the first 3 years, the gap between their professional worlds had felt like a charming detail, rather than a fault line, an interesting asymmetry, a counterpoint that made them more interesting as a pair than two people of identical achievement and identical ambition would have been. Diana's friends teased her about marrying a mechanic, and she had laughed it off with genuine ease, even defended him with warmth, because she had known then what she would later lose sight of, that Nathan was remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with his job title. He worked his hours, came home, cooked dinner when she came home too late to cook herself, and listened when she needed to talk through a difficult client situation. He asked good questions, specific, intelligent ones, that revealed he had been paying real attention, and he never made her feel small for needing to talk through her fears. He read widely. Physics, engineering history, biographies of inventors, the occasional novel that a customer had left in the waiting area. He could hold a conversation about aerospace propulsion principles with the same ease with which he discussed the plot of a novel he had read while eating lunch on the hood of a car he was restoring on weekends. He was, she would understand much later, one of the most genuinely curious people she had ever known. But curiosity, in a person whose professional presentation does not signal it, tends to go unrecognized by people who have learned to read credentials rather than character. As her career accelerated and her social world shifted, more client dinners at restaurants that required reservations 3 months in advance, more industry conferences in cities that expected a certain kind of wardrobe, more evenings in rooms where every person wore their achievements as a kind of armor, she began to feel a friction she had never anticipated. She began to dread the moment at cocktail parties when someone inevitably asked what her husband did for a living. She began to hear, or imagined she heard, a particular tone in certain people's voices when she answered something between sympathy and amusement that she could not entirely locate but could not stop sensing. She began to want Nathan to be different. She began to ask. She asked him first gently, framing it as concern for his professional growth, as though the request were for his benefit rather than her comfort. Then, with increasing directness, as the patience required to maintain the polite framing wore thin, she suggested he might take business courses or apply the mechanical intelligence he so clearly possessed to something with more social prestige: engineering consultancy, aviation maintenance management, technical project coordination, anything that came with a title she could say in a crowded room without watching for someone's reaction. Nathan listened each time with the same patient attention he gave everything. And each time, he declined. He told her, without defensiveness and without the particular sadness of someone being denied something they want, that he loved his work, that there was something in the act of diagnosing a broken machine, understanding precisely what had failed and why, tracing the failure back to its origin, and restoring the system to function that gave him a satisfaction he had never found anywhere else. He told her that a man who abandoned what he loved for the sake of what other people thought of him was a man who would spend the rest of his life performing rather than living. Diana heard these answers as stubbornness, as the comfortable resistance of a person who lacked the ambition to want more. She did not yet understand that they were convictions. She did not yet understand that there is a difference between a man who cannot imagine more and a man who has already decided what more means to him. The distance between them grew the way cracks spread in old concrete, slowly, invisibly, until one day the surface gives way all at once, and there is nothing left to stand on. By the time she slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table and told him their marriage had become a burden she no longer wished to carry, she had already convinced herself the decision was entirely his fault. And that conviction felt clean and certain, in a way that real truths rarely do. The lawyer's office was on the 18th floor of a glass building in Midtown. A space designed to project neutrality: pale walls, low lighting, chairs that were expensive but not comfortable, the particular aesthetic of a place that wants to suggest it is above the messiness of what happens inside it. Diana arrived 12 minutes early in a charcoal blazer and heels that added 2 inches to a height that was already considerable. She had pulled her dark hair back with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was communication, and she sat at the conference table with her hands folded and her posture immaculate, the portrait of a woman entirely in command of the situation. Nathan arrived at exactly the scheduled time in dark trousers and a clean button-down shirt, no tie, no suit jacket. He looked like a man who had dressed with care but not with performance, and the contrast between them was not lost on the attorney, a measured man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled enough divorces to recognize when a power dynamic was being dramatized for an audience of one. The terms were simple enough on paper. There was no shared property of consequence. The house was Diana's, purchased with her money before the marriage, and she had kept her business assets cleanly separate throughout. There were no children. There were no disclosed business entanglements. Diana had insisted on a clean split, with the efficiency of someone who wanted the whole enterprise concluded before lunch. Gerald Fitch walked through the documents with the methodical care of someone who understood that speed in a lawyer's office tends to produce regret, and Diana listened with the posture of someone tolerating a necessary formality. When Fitch paused to allow Nathan time to read the settlement terms in full, Diana tilted her head and offered, with a smile she had not troubled herself to soften, that she had taken the liberty of including a monthly support stipend in the terms. She called it a practical consideration, given the disparity in their financial situations. The way she said it, the particular lightness of it, the absence of any acknowledgement that the offer might carry weight, was the way a person drops a coin into a beggar's cup while already looking elsewhere, with the performance of generosity and the reality of something considerably less kind. She added that she sincerely hoped he would use the time after the divorce to consider some of the professional options she had been suggesting for years, and that she believed, with what she presented as genuine warmth, that he was capable of more, if he were only willing to try. Gerald Fitch cleared his throat. He studied the surface of the table with great attention. Nathan read the documents in full, every page, every clause, with the careful and unhurried attention of a man accustomed to specifications that cannot be skimmed. He turned to the last page and signed his name in a single clean motion. He slid the folder back across the table without a word. Diana watched him stand, button the top button of his shirt, and walk to the door. She expected, in that last moment, some sign of fracture, a tremor in the set of his jaw, a final look over his shoulder, some acknowledgement of everything she believed he was losing. There was none. He opened the door and walked through it with the unhurried ease of a man who had already decided exactly where he was going. And she was left staring at the space where he had been, feeling, beneath the composed surface of her victory, the first cold breath of something she would not identify as doubt until much later. She followed him out because she could not stop herself. She told herself it was the elevator timing, that they simply happened to descend together, that she simply happened to exit the building through the same revolving door and step onto the same stretch of midtown pavement at nearly the same moment. But that was not the truth. The truth was that his calm had unsettled her in a way she had not anticipated, and she needed to see it crack. She wanted the ordinary sedan in the parking garage, the drive back to Stamford, the visible confirmation of the ordinary life she had decided to leave behind. What she saw instead was a car she recognized immediately and could not quite believe was real in this context, a matte black Bentley Continental, one of perhaps 40 in the country in that configuration, a vehicle that existed on waiting lists measured in years rather than months, idling at the curb directly in front of the building's entrance with the patient stillness of something accustomed to waiting for someone worth waiting for. A driver in a dark uniform stood beside the rear door. He was not a hired transportation service driver. He had the particular bearing of someone whose role was not simply to move a person from one place to another, but to manage every detail of that movement with a precision that required long practice and a very specific kind of principle. As Nathan stepped through the building's revolving door, the driver straightened, moved to the door with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and opened it with a slight inclination of his head. He said something Diana could not fully hear over the ambient noise of the street, the taxis, the foot traffic, the low percussive hum of a city running through its afternoon. But she heard two words with absolute clarity, as though the city had briefly quieted specifically for them. He called Nathan chairman. She stood on the sidewalk and did not move. She watched the Bentley's door close. She watched the car pull into traffic with the unhurried ease of something that has never needed to rush because the thing it is carrying has never been in a hurry. She stood there for what felt like a very long time, and then she walked back to her own car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared at the steering wheel without starting the engine. She started the car eventually. She went in the direction the Bentley had gone, caught up with it in the stop and start of midtown traffic, and followed it at a careful distance through the Upper West Side, over the bridge, north along a route that took them steadily away from the density of the city toward a stretch of private airfield. She had driven past 100 times without ever thinking about what it contained. The Bentley cleared a security gate she did not have the credentials to pass. She stopped on the service road and watched through the chain link as her ex-husband walked across the tarmac toward a white and silver aircraft with a logo on its tail, a stylized double helix rendered in silver, angular and precise, wrapped around the silhouette of a turbine blade. She photographed it on her phone. She zoomed in until the image dissolved into pixels, then opened a search window and described what she saw. The results came back in under 4 seconds. Cole Aerospace Systems. Headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. Facilities in Seattle, Munich, and Osaka. Founded 11 years ago. Current valuation, $4.3 billion. Chairman and primary shareholder, Nathan A. Cole. She read the words 4 times. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat. She picked it up again. She found a photograph on the company's About page taken at a Munich aerospace conference 7 years earlier. Nathan, in a dark jacket, standing with a group of engineers in front of a prototype engine casing, looking at something outside the frame with the expression she had seen 10,000 times across their kitchen table, and never once thought to question, the expression of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at and why it matters. The biography beneath the photograph described a decade-long journey from independent mechanical research to patent filing to institutional partnership to global expansion. It mentioned, in the efficient language of corporate history, that the company's founding technology had been developed in a small independent workshop in Connecticut. It did not specify that the workshop was a single-bay garage behind a strip mall. Diana closed the browser and sat on the service road outside a private airfield and looked at the sky where the aircraft had been until there was nothing left to look at. She spent the following days assembling a picture the way she had learned to assemble investment cases systematically, through multiple sources, following each thread until it connected to another. She reached, through 2 intermediaries, a former aerospace industry analyst named Robert Carey, who had covered Cole Aerospace Systems since its earliest institutional funding rounds. Robert was semi-retired, with the particular directness of someone who no longer had anything to protect and who found the situation Diana was describing mildly satisfying, in a way he was too professional to fully express. He told her that Nathan Cole had filed his first patent 11 years ago for a variable compression turbine adaptation that reduced fuel consumption in mid-range commercial engines by nearly 19%, a figure that, in an industry where a 2% efficiency gain was considered significant, had caused the kind of attention that could not be kept quiet for long. He told her the patent had been licensed within 18 months by 3 of the largest aerospace manufacturers in the world. He told her the licensing revenue had funded a proper research facility, which had funded a second generation of patents, which had attracted a German conglomerate as a minority partner, which had set the valuation trajectory into motion. He told her that Nathan had operated for years with deliberate opacity, using holding companies and intermediaries for his licensing deals, keeping his name off public-facing materials wherever possible, conducting his affairs through a Stamford law firm whose discretion was well regarded in certain circles. Robert paused and then added, with the particular care of someone selecting words for a specific purpose, he always struck me as a man who was more interested in what he was building than in what people thought of what he was building. Diana thanked him and hung up and sat at her desk in an office full of things she had acquired as visible proof of her own worth. And she thought about a garage behind a strip mall and she thought about what had been happening inside it during all the years she had been too embarrassed to explain what her husband did for a living. She thought about the nights she had come home late and found him at the kitchen table with a legal pad covered in diagrams, component drawings, pressure calculations, little annotations in the precise small handwriting he used when he was working through something important. She had sometimes asked, in a tone that did not conceal her disinterest, what he was working on, and he had said engine efficiency problem or fuel flow geometry or simply something at the garage, and she had nodded and gone to check her email. And she had never once thought to ask a second question. She had not thought to ask because she had already decided that his work was not interesting, and when you have already decided something, the evidence that contradicts it tends to disappear into the blind spot you have positioned for exactly that purpose. She now understood that the legal pad she had seen was, in all probability, the documentation of a patent application that would eventually be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had walked past it and poured herself a glass of water and gone to bed. She had done this, in varying forms, hundreds of times across 9 years of marriage. The realization settled into her chest and did not move. She looked up the patent filings through a public database, and she found them 12 in total, spanning 11 years, each one building on the architecture of the last. She was not an engineer and could not parse the technical specifications, but she could read the abstract summaries, and what she read in those summaries was the portrait of someone who had spent more than a decade pursuing a single complex problem from every possible angle, filing each incremental breakthrough as its own document, accumulating a body of work with the patience of someone who understood that extraordinary things take the time they take. She cross-referenced the filing dates against her memory of their marriage and found that the third patent, the one Robert had described as the breakthrough that made the licensing deals possible, had been filed 4 months after she had told Nathan, at a dinner where he had come to meet 3 of her most important clients, that he might want to consider what he was going to do with his life. She had said it quietly, but not quietly enough. He had looked at her across the table, with an expression she had told herself was hurt but had actually, she understood now, been something more complex. The particular expression of a person who is hearing something untrue said about them and is choosing, for reasons of dignity and love, not to correct it in front of an audience. He had driven home that night in silence. She had assumed the silence was sulking. She now thought it was more likely the silence of a man who had returned, in his mind, to the only thing that had never confused him. The problem he was solving in a garage behind a strip mall, one precise, patient calculation at a time. She traced the financial crisis backwards through time, through documents and records. She now had the motive and the access to find. 3 years ago, Harlow Meridian Group had faced its most serious liquidity crisis. A cascade of contract failures and a real estate position that had collapsed in the span of 4 months, producing the particular sensation of watching something you have built entirely by your own hand begin to tilt toward a fall. She remembered those months with a physical vividness. The 6 in the morning calls with her CFO, the meetings with the bank, the careful management of information to prevent a panic among her clients, the nights she could not sleep and lay in the dark beside Nathan, who had asked once how she was doing, and listened to her answer with such complete attention that she had almost told him the truth. She remembered the moment the crisis stabilized a new credit facility, an equity injection from an entity she had been too grateful and too exhausted to examine closely. The entity had been a Delaware-registered investment vehicle called Meridian Bridge Partners. She had assumed, without investigation, that it was one of the institutional contacts her CFO had been cultivating for months. It took a paralegal and 48 hours to trace the holding structure through 3 layers of registration. The original beneficial owner of Meridian Bridge Partners was a trust registered in Connecticut, administered by a law firm in Stamford, whose name she now recognized. The trust's principal was Nathan A. Cole. He had placed $2.1 million into the instrument that had kept her company alive. He had never mentioned it, not during the crisis, not in the months after, not in any of the years between then and the morning he had sat across a conference table and signed his name to the end of their marriage. He had come home during those months and cooked dinner and asked how she was sleeping and listened when she needed to talk, and he had never once given her any indication that he was the reason she still had something to be afraid for. He had stood in the architecture of her crisis without letting her see that he was holding part of it up. She thought about that specific quality of care, the kind that does not require acknowledgement, that does not calculate a return, that simply goes about the work of protecting the person it loves without making the protection into a transaction, and she thought about how rarely she had encountered it in the world she inhabited, a world organized almost entirely around the visibility of contribution, where effort that went unrecognized was effort that might as well not have happened. Nathan had operated by a completely different set of principles. He had done what he believed needed doing, and had then gone home and made soup, and she had eaten the soup and complained about a difficult client, and he had listened without once mentioning that he had just spent $2.1 million saving the company that difficult client had a contract with. She pressed her palms flat on the surface of her desk and held very still for a long moment, and outside the windows of her office, the city continued its motion with the complete indifference of a thing that does not wait for people to finish understanding their own lives before moving on. She found the letter by accident. She had gone back to the house they had shared. He had already moved his things, cleanly and without ceremony. In the week after the documents were signed, to collect some files she had left in the study, and while she was pulling a box down from the closet shelf, a small envelope fell from behind it and landed face up on the floor. It was not sealed. Her name was written on the front in his handwriting. Her first name only, just Diana, in the careful block letters he used when he was writing something he meant to be read with full attention. She unfolded the single sheet inside and read it in the light of the open closet door. He had written, "I know you are ashamed of me, and I want you to understand that I do not blame you for it. I know that the world you have built for yourself requires a certain kind of person standing beside you, and I know that I have made that difficult. I have watched you for a long time, watching other people watch us, and I have understood what you were feeling, even when you did not say it. I am not writing this to make you feel guilty. I am writing it because I still believe, with whatever part of me still allows itself to believe things, that you might one day look at me, not at what I do or do not do, not at what you imagine others see when they look at us, but at me. I have loved you in every form you have taken. I have loved you in the years when you were uncertain, and in the years when you became formidable. I have asked nothing of you, except that you see me with the same honesty that you bring to everything else in your life. I am afraid that, if I give you this letter, it will become another thing between us rather than a bridge across the distance. So I will keep it, and I will hope that you find your way to that kind of seeing on your own, without needing me to ask you for it." He had not dated it. He had not signed it. He had simply stopped writing and folded the paper and placed it in an envelope with her name on it, and left it somewhere she might have lived in that house for another 10 years without finding. She sat on the closet floor with the letter in her hands and cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in years, not the controlled release of a bad day or a disappointing outcome, but something older and far less manageable. The kind of grief that comes from understanding that you had the precise thing you needed and made the active, sustained choice not to recognize it. She thought about the night early in their marriage when she had come home at midnight from a client dinner and found him awake in the kitchen with 2 cups of tea he had made at exactly the right time, waiting not because she had asked him to, but because he had wanted to. She thought about the way he had looked at her from across the room at her firm's annual gala, not with the hunger of someone desperate to belong to a world he had been excluded from, but with the steady, unhurried warmth of a man who already knew exactly where he stood and had decided it was entirely sufficient. She thought about every conversation across the years in which she had compressed him into the flattest version of what she feared he was: simple, limited, and embarrassment by association, and she understood, sitting on the floor of a closet in a house that now echoed with nothing but her own movement, that the compression had been entirely her own failure, and that failure had cost her the one person who had ever loved her with complete honesty and no conditions attached. She stood up. She folded the letter with the care you extend to something that can no longer be undamaged but can at least be held carefully. She drove across the city toward a glass tower in the financial district, whose address she had found that morning, a building she had driven past without knowing it for years. The lobby of Cole Aerospace Systems corporate headquarters was not what she had expected, though she had not been able to say precisely what she had expected. It was clean and spare, with high ceilings and a long reception desk, and the kind of quiet that comes from a building full of people who are thinking hard. There were no oversized logos, no portraits of the founder framed like a deity, no ostentatious declarations of what $4.3 billion looked like from the inside. There was a single large photograph, simply framed, hanging on the wall to the left of the entrance, the first prototype engine Nathan had built, compact and oil-smudged and almost handmade looking, displayed without caption or explanation, as though its presence were self-evidently enough. Diana stood in front of it for a moment before giving her name at the desk. She recognized in the object something she had been in the same room with for 9 years and never truly seen. After 17 minutes, Nathan's assistant appeared and escorted her to a conference room on the 22nd floor with windows that looked out over the city. Nathan had built something extraordinary inside of while she had been embarrassed to be seen with him at dinner parties. Nathan came in 4 minutes after she sat down. He was wearing a gray sweater and dark trousers, and he looked, as he always had, like a man who dressed for himself rather than for the impression the room required. He sat across from her and waited. She had prepared what she intended to say. She had written notes during the drive over, sequenced like a presentation key acknowledgments. The arc of her understanding, the specific request she was making. She did not consult the notes. She looked at him, at the particular quality of his attention, at the steadiness that had once felt like an anchor, and that she had spent years mistaking for limitation, and everything she had prepared dissolved. She said his name. She said she was sorry, which was the most inadequate true thing she knew how to say. She said she had been wrong in ways she was only beginning to understand the full scope of wrong, not merely about the facts of who he was, but about the entire framework through which she had been deciding what people were worth and by what measure. She said she had measured him, consistently and deliberately, against criteria that had nothing to do with the things that actually determine the value of a person. She said she had been so consumed by the accumulation of evidence of her own worth that she had lost the capacity to recognize worth that did not resemble her own. She said she had read his letter. She watched his face at that, a small and controlled movement. But she knew his face well enough to read it. And what she read was not surprise so much as a specific grief, the recognition of something private discovered in the way private things sometimes are, too late and by the wrong light. She said she had no right to ask for anything, and was asking anyway. Whether any part of him was still willing to allow her the chance to be the person who saw him honestly. She finished speaking, and waited. She, who had spent her entire professional life engineering rooms so that she would never have to be the one who waited, simply waited. Nathan was quiet for a long time. He said that he had loved her. And he said it in the past tense, with the simple steadiness of a man reporting a fact rather than lodging an accusation. He said the love had been real, not a performance, not something he had applied to her because of what she represented, but a genuine and specific thing directed at her in particular. He said he had watched her become extraordinary and had been proud of her with a completeness he had never found adequate words to express. He said the difficulty had not been her ambition. It had been the quality that had grown in beneath her ambition over time, the way it had gradually made her treat the people around her as reflections of her own standing, rather than as separate and complete lives unto themselves. He said there had been 100 small moments across the years in which he had waited to see if that might change, and he had kept waiting long past the point where hope had become simply a habit rather than a genuine expectation. He said he forgave her. He said it without theatrical weight, the way a precise and practical person states something that has already been decided internally and simply needs to be said aloud. And then he said that forgiveness and a second chance were entirely different things, and that he hoped she could hold that distinction clearly, because it mattered to him that she understand it without softening. He stood. He looked at her for a moment across the conference table, with an expression she could not name, but would carry with her for a long time, not unkind, not closed, not full of the satisfaction of a person who has won something. Just final, in the specific way of a door that has been closed gently and completely. She did not cry in that room. She saved it for the elevator. Alone in the descent. Her hand flat against the cold wall, her eyes shut. The months that followed were a form of education she had not chosen and could not refuse. She began, with the methodical persistence she brought to all things, to dismantle the architecture of assumptions through which she had been operating. She started to ask different questions, not just what a person had achieved, but how, and at what cost, and whether the cost was one they had chosen or one that had been exacted from them without their full awareness. She noticed, with a sharpness that had not previously been available to her, how much of the professional and social world she inhabited was organized around the performance of worth rather than its actual possession. How many of the rooms she had worked so hard to enter were full of people who were, like she had been, primarily concerned with being seen to belong rather than with doing anything worth belonging for. She began pulling back from the performances and investing the reclaimed time in things that required genuine effort in the direction of other people. She had a difficult conversation with her CFO about the firm's culture, which had grown, without her fully noticing, into something that rewarded the right appearance of expertise over the actual exercise of it. She made changes that cost her certain relationships and strengthened others, and she found, to her surprise, that the ones that survived the changes were the ones she had not expected to keep, and the ones that dissolved were ones she had not examined closely enough to know were already hollow. She launched a mentorship initiative for first-generation professional women in Bridgeport, spending Tuesday evenings sitting across from young women in a community center who reminded her of herself at an age when the right information could still reroute everything. She told them, without sentiment or preamble, that the most dangerous assumption a competent person can make is that their own form of competence is the standard against which all other people should be measured, and that the failure to recognize value in unfamiliar forms is not discernment, it is poverty of a particular kind. She told them that the people worth keeping in your life were rarely the ones whose worth was the most immediately legible, and that the ability to read worth in its less obvious forms was not a personality trait but a discipline, something you had to practice until it became instinct. She said it with the authority of someone who had paid for the understanding at considerable cost. And they heard it the way young people hear things that carry genuine weight behind them, not as advice, but as evidence. She watched Nathan's company from a measured distance, with the respect of someone who had finally come to understand the scale of what she was observing, and who felt something she recognized, with some difficulty, as pride, not the pride of ownership or association, but the simpler, cleaner pride of someone who had been in the presence of an extraordinary thing and had finally stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. Cole Aerospace Systems announced a partnership with a Japanese technology consortium to develop next-generation propulsion systems that the aviation press called potentially the most significant development in commercial propulsion in 2 decades. There was a photograph of Nathan at the announcement ceremony in Osaka, standing with engineers on either side of a prototype casing, in a jacket she recognized from a dinner she had organized 3 years ago, not looking at the camera but at the engine, wearing the expression she had seen 1,000 times across a kitchen table, and never once recognized as the face of a man who was doing exactly what he had always been doing, regardless of who was watching. She saw him once more, from across a hotel lobby in New York during a conference that neither of them had known the other would attend. He was in a conversation with a small group and did not see her. She stood with a cup of coffee she had largely stopped needing, and watched the people around him lean slightly forward in the way of people who find the conversation worth their complete attention, not the calculated attentiveness of networking, but the involuntary lean of genuine interest. He had always generated that in people. She had mistaken it, for years, for ordinariness, for the comfortable sociability of someone with no particular place to be. She understood now that it had been something far less common. The quality of a person who never made anyone feel like an interruption. She went to her panel and said what she had been invited to say. And she said it better than she had in years. Because she was no longer performing for a room, she was simply telling people what she had learned, and the difference in the quality of the attention she received surprised her and then, on reflection, did not. On a Thursday evening in late November, standing on the roof terrace of her building with a glass of wine she had mostly stopped drinking, she watched an aircraft cross the orange and violet horizon and disappear into the approaching dark. She thought about a line from a letter she had read on a closet floor, the line about hoping she would find her way to that kind of seeing on her own, and she thought about the patience required to write that sentence, to feel the thing behind it, and still believe enough in her to leave the letter in a place where she might find it, or might not. She thought about how simple the thing it asked for had been, and how large the failure to provide it. She had lost a man who had loved her honestly, which is the rarest thing most people spend their entire lives searching for. She had lost him because she had not known, until it was entirely too late, what rarity looked like when it stood in front of you in a worn work shirt, with grease under its fingernails and eyes, that saw you completely and stayed anyway. The knowledge was not comfort, but it was true, and she had decided, with the particular determination that had always been her most reliable quality, and had now, at last, been pointed in a useful direction, to let the truth be enough, not to close around it, not to harden it into bitterness, but to carry it forward as the most expensive lesson she had ever been taught and the one she intended to earn, day by day, for the rest of her life. Some people carry their greatness quietly, not because they are ashamed of it, but because they have never needed it confirmed by anyone else's recognition, because the work itself has always been sufficient reward, and the validation of the world has always been, to them, a pleasant irrelevance at best. Nathan Cole had been one of these people, and Diana had spent 9 years living beside that quality without seeing it, the way you can spend years living beside a river without understanding the depth of the water until the day you step in. The error is not in their concealment. The error is entirely in the seeing and the shortcuts we take when we decide, quickly and on the basis of surfaces, that we already know what a person is worth before we have done the actual slow and careful work of looking. We are trained, in the world Diana Harlow had built her life inside, to read certain signals as worth and others as its absence. The title, the address, the brand of the car, the fluency with which someone navigates a restaurant menu that costs more than some people's weekly salary. We mistake the signals for the thing itself. We forget that the thing itself is almost always somewhere else entirely in the way a person listens, in the specific quality of their attention, in what they choose to do with the hours that belong to them and no one else. Respect is not a reward extended to those who have proved their value by our particular measure of proof. It is the first condition of love, the ground without which even the most genuine feeling cannot put down roots and survive the seasons. When it erodes, when it disappears quietly across 100 small moments that each seem too minor to address until they have accumulated into something that cannot be addressed, even the truest love cannot continue. It becomes something that was true once, that remains true in the past tense, but that the present tense can no longer contain. Diana Harlow had learned this at a cost she would not fully recover from, and she had decided that the only honest response to a lesson that expensive was to carry it forward as something other than only a wound to make it, over time, into a way of seeing that might spare other people the specific grief of understanding something too late to use it. Somewhere above the city, a jet bearing a silver helix climbed toward its cruising altitude, carrying a man who had never needed anyone to know how high he could go only once to be seen clearly by the one person he had chosen for his life. That chance had passed with the quiet finality of things that do not announce their departure until they are already gone. What remained was the lesson and the rest of a life in which to practice what it taught. Do not wait until the departure gate closes to look at the person beside you with the honesty they were always owed. The most painful loss is not losing a billionaire. It is losing the person who loved you sincerely, who saw you completely, and chose to stay anyway while they were still standing close enough to reach.